Hello again. My name's Mary, and I work in the children's room at the Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. And I'm here to start our next book. So, we enjoy coming to see you every day, and we're hoping you're enjoying some of our stories. Today, I'm going to be starting a book called Some Writer, the story of E.B. White. This book was written and illustrated by Melissa Sweet, and it was published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. I'll show you this photograph at the beginning. The baby is E.B. White, and that's the rest of his family, his brothers and sisters and parents. I believed then, as I do now, in the goodness of the published word. It seemed to contain an essential goodness, like the smell of leaf mold. E.B. White. And here's another picture of E.B. White with his dog. I'm not getting it there. That's his dog, Beppo. Some Writer, the story of E.B. White by Melissa Sweet. E.B. White used a manual typewriter. A manual typewriter works by inserting a sheet of paper onto a roller, press a type key, such as an E, and a lever swings a type hammer, which strikes an inked ribbon, making a printed impression of the E onto the paper. And this here is E.B. White. All's right with the world department. I fell in love with the sound of an early typewriter and have been stuck with it ever since. Elwin Brooks White became a writer while he was still wearing knickers. He was 7 or 8 years old when he looked a sheet of paper square in the eyes and thought, "This is where I belong. This is it." He was born on July 11, 1899, and later chose 7 and 11 as his lucky numbers. That same year, in downtown New York City, not far from his home, a reservoir was being filled to make way for a new library with a children's room, where N, as he was called, would later take out books. N was about 5 years old when his brother, Stan, whom the family called Bun, because he could wiggle his nose like a bunny, taught him to read by sounding out words from the New York Times. If N came across a word he didn't know, his father made him look it up in Webster's dictionary. At dinner, his father, who loved words, recited limericks. All 6 children would try to finish the last line. N's mother, Jessie, was quiet and kind. She loved her garden and raising broods of baby chicks. Each year at Christmas, she placed her dream farm, a tiny wooden farm, under the Christmas tree. When he entered 1st grade, N discovered school began with an assembly. Every day, after the students recited the Pledge of Allegiance and sang a song, the principal called a different student to the platform to read aloud. He went in alphabetical order, and for years N sat in terror as the names got closer to W. The day he heard Elwin White, N made his way to the stage and began reading a poem from Longfellow. It had the line, "Footprints on the sands of time," but Elwin's words came out, "the tans of Sime." Other kids started laughing, and the moment on stage became even worse than N had imagined it would be. He could not finish. He vowed never to go up on a stage again. On his way home, his dog Mac met him as usual at the corner. In the quiet of the barn, N tended his chicks, his lizards, and his pigeons. For 6 years, Mac met me at the same place after school and convoyed me home, a service he thought up himself. The boy doesn't forget that sort of association. As a child, I was frightened, but not unhappy. My parents were loving and kind. We were a large family, and were a small kingdom unto ourselves. Nobody ever came to dinner. We lived in a large house in a leafy suburb where there were backyards and stables and grape arbors. I lacked for nothing except confidence. I suffered nothing except the routine terrors of childhood: fear of the dark, fear of the future, fear of the return to school after a summer on a lake in Maine, fear of making an appearance on a platform, fear that I was unknowing about things I should know about. I was, as a child, allergic to pollens and dust, and still am. It may be, as some critics suggest, that it helps to have an unhappy childhood. If so, I have no knowledge of it. From the Paris Review, 1969. Elwin's father, Samuel White, worked at a piano company on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. One of the fringe benefits being the son of a piano man, Elwin wrote later, was that our parlor at 101 Summit Avenue was well supplied with musical instruments. All 6 kids played instruments. We were practically a ready-made band. All we lacked was talent. We had violins, cellos, mandolins, guitars, banjos, and drums, and there was always a lot of music filling the air in our home. None of it good. We sang, composed, harmonized, drummed, in an attempt to raise the general tone of the commotion. N was much younger than his siblings, so his father had more time to spend with him. Oh, the joy of my little boy. We have lots of good times together, Samuel White wrote to Albert. And for N's 12th birthday, he gave him an optimistic note. Elwin, my dear boy, all hail. With joy and gladness we salute you on your natal day. May each recurring anniversary bring you earth's best gifts and heaven's choicest blessings. Think today on your mercies. You've been born in the greatest and best land on the face of the globe under the best government known to men. Be thankful, then, that you are an American. Moreover, you're the youngest child of a large family and have profited by the companionship of older brothers and sisters. This is no small matter, for you are wiser by reason of their experiences. You haven't had to learn wisdom, you have absorbed it. You are the object of the affectionate solicitude of your mother and father. when you're fretted by the small things of life, remember that on this, your birthday, you heard a voice telling you to look up and out on the great things of life, and beholding them say, surely they are all mine. In conclusion, I congratulate you again, and with my warmest felicitation, I wish you great joy. I wish you all happiness, and I wish it for you with all my heart. Father. One Sunday afternoon, when N was about 5 years old, he and his family piled into a carriage for a ride. N started to sneeze. His eyes became red and itchy. His parents wondered if it was the horses, but they discovered N had hay fever and was allergic to pollen. The doctor prescribed dousing his head in cold water every morning. Later that year, Samuel White went to visit Elwin's older brothers, Al and Stan, who were staying with friends at a camp on the Belgrade Lakes in Maine. Would the crisp, clean air and cool lakes up north help N's hay fever? His father wondered. Mr. White made plans to take the whole family and their dog to Snug Harbor in Belgrade Lakes. Chapter 2. Once more to the lake. Life is always a rich and steady time when you're waiting for something to happen or to hatch. Getting to Maine was as much of an adventure as summering there. The family, packed for 1 month, took a train overnight from New York City. Mrs. White slept fully dressed so she would be ready when they arrived in Belgrade Lakes early the next morning. From there, they took a horse and wagon 10 miles to Snug Harbor. Mr. White had rented 2 small cabins at the edge of the lake. We Whites were city people, Anne later wrote. Everything about Belgrade was a new experience. The big freshwater lake, the pines and spruces and birches, the pastures with its sweet fern and juniper, the farmhouse where we took our meals, the rough camp with its sparsely furnished bedrooms, the boating, the swimming, and the company of other campers along the shore. During his summer without end, as Elwin later described it, Stan taught Anne how to paddle a canoe and use a jackknife. His brothers studied tortoises, turtles, tadpoles, and toads. In later years, they brought their homemade skiff, Jessie, named after Mrs. White, who couldn't swim and hated the water. No matter what the weather, the whole family crowded into the skiff and motored to town, like barn swallows in their nest. At Bean's store, Mr. White bought a case of Moxie's soda, assuring his family that the new drink, Coca-Cola, would never be as popular as Moxie. Anne began keeping a journal. He thought the word journal sounded more writerly than diary. He wrote in his journal every day for the next 20 years. It was just a cheap notebook that was always by his bed every night. Before he turned in, he would write in the book. He wrote about things he had done, things he had seen, and thoughts he had had. Sometimes he drew a picture. He always ended by asking himself a question. so he would have something to think about while falling asleep. From The Trumpet of the Swan, date 1970. For N's 11th birthday, his father gave him a green wood and canvas old town canoe. Now, the best part of the summer was not just being out of school, but waking early, before the rest of the family, and sneaking out onto the lake in his own canoe. He would set out along the edge of the glassy lake in the shadows of the pines, paddling quietly so as not to disturb the stillness of the cathedral, as he called the motionless water. There was a lake, and at the water's edge, a granite rock upholstered in lichen. This was his pew, and the sermon went on forever. From Reader's Digest, title, A Boy I Knew, date 1940. One summer, the Whites invited Elwin's friend, Freddy Schuler, to join them in Maine. 15-year-old Elwin made Freddy a brochure to prepare him for one of the most beautiful states in the Union and one of the most beautiful of the lakes of Maine, and wanted his friend to love Snug Harbor as much as he did. From the brochure. Belgrade Lake. Maine's one of the most beautiful states in the Union, and Belgrade is one of the most beautiful of the lakes of Maine. This wonderful lake is 5 miles wide and about 10 miles long, with many coves, points, and islands. Here's some pictures of Elwin's or N's cursive writing. And you can see that he kept that journal and wrote down his thoughts every day. And he wrote that brochure for his friend, Freddy. Freddy did join the Whites that summer, and he and Elwin spent their days fishing, canoeing, swimming. Much too soon, Elwin knew, it'd be time to go back to school. But he also knew that when he returned the next summer, the lake would be exactly as he had left it. Chapter 3, Years of Wonder. I took to writing early to assuage my uneasiness and collect my thoughts. And I was a busy writer long before I went into long pants. One by one, N's brothers and sisters left their home in New York. Al and Stan graduated from Cornell University. Lillian attended Vassar College, and his other sisters married and had children. At 5 years old, N was already an uncle. Elwin could canoe, ice skate, play Aida on the piano, and ride his bike backwards while sitting on the handlebars. But girls terrified him. He also liked to write poems, stories, and letters to his siblings, sometimes signing his letter Sir Elwin White or Buttercup. When he was 9, Anne sent a poem to Albert, his brother, at Cornell. And a few months later, Anne submitted it to a woman's home companion contest, and won his first literary prize. This is from a letter written in 1908. In it, Anne told Albert, "I wrote a poem about a little mouse. I'm sorry I wrote that poem because I'm trying to catch a mouse, and that won't encourage them, will it?" A Story of a Little Mouse by Elwin White. Once there was a wise little mouse. At least that's what he thought. But this experience shows you just what his wisdom brought. One day as he walked through the kitchen, a wire box he spied, and in it was a hunk of cheese, which he very carefully eyed. Then he decided he'd have some. So in the box he stepped, farther and farther and farther. Very cautiously he crept. Then he decided, but all of a sudden the trap sprang and cut right off his head, for the cruel trap had been laid for him, and there he lay quite dead. As a lesson for a little mouse, I certainly advise that mice had better be careful and try not to be too wise. Anne began sending his stories to St. Nicholas, a monthly magazine for young readers. One of the magazine's most popular features was the St. Nicholas League contest, held for the best stories, essays, poems, drawings, and snapshots and puzzles. If a piece was published, the artist would win a gold or silver badge. Anyone could join the league. Other budding writers, Edna St. Vincent Millay, William Faulkner, Eudora Welty, and Rachel Carson were members. Anne later described the league members as an industrious and fiendishly competitive band of tots. A neighborhood friend, E. Barrett Brady, pointed out that the stories that won prizes were often about being kind to animals. All his life, Anne had been kind to animals. He had tended to pigeons, dogs, snakes, pollywogs, turtles, rabbits, lizards, singing birds, chameleons, caterpillars, and mice. So it wasn't hard for him to write a story about animals. When he wrote A Winter Walk about a dog and woodland animals, it won a silver badge from St. Nicholas. A few years later, a true dog story about his dog Beppo won the coveted gold medal. In high school, Anne began writing for the Oracle, his school newspaper. But the best part of high school, he said, was getting to and fro, which was on my bicycle. Girls may have noticed him, but he didn't have the nerve to ask them out. Anne was still in high school when World War I broke out. He had his heart set on going to Cornell University, just like his brothers, and was accepted and awarded scholarships that more than covered the $100 a year tuition. Still, in 1917, the summer before Elwin went to college, he wrote in his journal, May 27. I don't know what to do this summer. The country is at war, and I think I ought to serve. July 5. My utter dependence galls me, and I am living the life of a slacker. But Anne didn't weigh enough to join the army. Finally, he joined the cadets and worked on a farm for the summer. even though he was about to leave for Cornell in the fall, his journal entry on his birthday was no more enthusiastic. July 11. 18, and still no future. I'd be more contented in prison, for there at least I would know precisely what I had to look forward to. I didn't care for athletics, being skinny and small, but I liked ice ponds and skating, and on winter afternoons and evenings I'd visit a pond, a 15-minute ride on a trolley car, and skate with a girl named Mildred Hess. Together, we must have covered hundreds of miles, sometimes leaving the pond proper and gliding into the woods on narrow fingers of ice. We didn't talk much, never embraced. We just skated for the ecstasy of skating, a magical glide. This brief interlude on ice had a dreamlike quality, a purity that has stayed with me all my life. And when nowadays I see a winter sky and feel the wind dropping with the sun and the naked trees against a reddening west, I remember what it was like to be in love before any of love's complexities, realities, or disturbances had entered in, to dilute its splendor and challenge its perfection. From Letters of E.B. White, date 1976. Elwin arrived at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, a few days before classes started. He checked into a hotel to wait, and in his enthusiasm, he became so engrossed in what was going on in town, the trolleys, the walking paths, and Lake Cayuga, that days went by before he realized classes had already begun. Elwin liked Cornell. His classmates nicknamed him Andy, after Cornell's first president, Andrew Dixon White. From then on, to friends and family, Elwin White was Andy White. His professors became part of his social life. Students met at Professor Adams' house for cocoa and chess. Andy joined Professor Sampson's manuscript club. From Professor Strunk, he learned to omit needless words in his writing. And he fell in love with Henry David Thoreau's Walden. Andy began writing for the school newspaper, the Cornell Sun, which he found much more interesting than studying. He got a D in English his second semester. When he became editor of the Sun, it took so much of his time, he was excused from his English class. He wrote his mother, "This morning came news of my utter redemption from my deepest gloom, which is merely to say, I don't have to write so much stuff every day." I'd send my son to Cornell because Will Strunk Jr. is there. I'd send him there to walk up 6 Mile Creek in the early wetness of a recalcitrant spring. From E.B. White, a biography, date 1985. One year, Andy took a class in medieval history. The professor, George Lincoln Burr, taught in such a way that Andy was transported back centuries. He learned that when tyrants reign, society sacrificed freedom. In Andy's senior year, it was Burr who stood up for a Cornell student who was being bullied into wearing a freshman cap, a tradition upperclassmen had come up with for all freshmen. The student had refused to wear it, and the campus was in an uproar. But Burr observed, "A matter of garb seems to me a small thing to fight about. What chance for discussion? What room for protest? There's no safety valve so precious to civil order as legitimate freedom of thought and speech." Andy said that meeting Burr was the single greatest thing that ever happened in his life. Burr introduced Andy to a part of himself he had not yet discovered. Andy saw with blinding clarity how important it was to live with the freedom to express ideas, to be free. Andy wrote later, is to feel you belong to the earth. For the first time, Andy had a focus for his thoughts, for his principles. He began to consider writing for a living. After graduation, Andy took a job as a counselor at Camp Otter in Canada. A classmate from Cornell, Howard Cushman, went too. Neither wanted to rush into a job in an office. Maybe they'd go out west for a while. What was the hurry to have a regular job? Chapter 4. From Sea to Shining Sea. A person who is looking for something doesn't travel very fast. When he returned home from camp, Andy had a series of writing jobs that he disliked. He and Cush made plans to go west. Andy bought a Model T Roadster for about $400 and named it Hotspur. He and Cush organized camping gear and packed their clothes. A cigar box fill, 2 Corona typewriters, and a Webster's dictionary. To remind them their true destination was the world of letters. Andy said nothing about this trip to his parents. The night before they were ready to leave, Cush joined Andy at the White's house for dinner. At the supper table, Andy announced they were heading out west in the morning, leaving no time for his parents to talk him out of the trip. Andy and Cush had no real plan except to go west and pay their way by writing as they went along. They were in no hurry. In 1922, the roads that crossed America were sometimes just paths through fields. Signs were often arrows made from old shingles. They deliberately didn't even pack a road map. Like Thoreau, still a favorite author of Andy's, they were traveling light and trying new adventures. The Model T was not a fussy car. It sprang cheerfully toward any stretch of wasteland, whether there was a noticeable road underfoot or not. The course of my life was changed by it, and it is in a class by itself. It was cheap enough, so I could afford to buy one. It was capable enough, so it gave me courage to start. From Sea to Shining Sea. Date, 1953. Now, if we ever, is the time to bum about a bit. Now, if ever, is the time to bum about a bit. So here we go. jogging leisurely from one free meal to the next, taking a general westerly direction. Writing a lot, selling a little maybe, and chopping proverbial wood to eke out a supper. From Letters of E.B. White, date 1922. That afternoon, we washed dirt from ourselves and our clothes in 10 Mile Lake and slept there in a little pine grove. From Letters of E.B. White, date 1922. When they arrived in Seattle 6 months later, Andy wrote that he had left a track across the United States as erratic as a mouse's track in the snow. He found a job as a reporter with the Seattle Times. Cush headed back home. As a reporter, Andy hated to be told what to write, but he liked his boss. When Andy asked how to describe a story, his boss thought for a moment and then said, "Just say the words." It was sound advice that Andy remembered the rest of his life. The Seattle Times gave him a chance to write small personal pieces, but eventually Andy was laid off. That was fine with him. He preferred to be footloose. Andy took a ship to Alaska and Siberia before heading home. On returning to New York, he lived with his parents and commuted to a new job in advertising in Manhattan. Andy still sent out his light verses, sonnets, and squibs to magazines, mostly for no pay, just for the sheer glory of sometimes seeing his writing in print. At night, on Long Island Sound, he sailed his canoe rigged with sails made of bed sheets. Then a friend told him about a brand new magazine that might like Andy's sense of humor. In February of 1925, Andy swung into Grand Central Terminal, laid 15 cents on the line, and bought the very first issue of The New Yorker. 9 weeks later, the new magazine published a piece by E.B. White. Chapter 5, Answers to Hard Questions. I discovered that writing of the small things of the day, the trivial matters of the heart, was the only kind of creative work which I could accomplish with any sincerity or grace. Andy called himself a short writer. He described the New Yorker pieces as short, relaxed, and sometimes funny. The magazine set out to create a witty weekly about life in New York City. With each issue they produced, the New Yorker editors were figuring out what kind of magazine it would be. No one predicted that this magazine, filled with sassy cartoons, would become one of the preeminent literary journals in America. That year, the New Yorker published more of Andy's writing, but he still sent his work to other newspapers and magazines, including New York World, which had a column called The Conning Tower. For a young writer, to see his work in the tower, as Andy called it, was a high point, a moment in the sun. In the summer of 1926, Andy moved into an apartment in Greenwich Village with 3 Cornell classmates. Though he wanted people to read his work, he didn't feel obligated to mingle with other writers. He liked how the city gave him the gift of loneliness and the gift of privacy. Both Harold Ross, publisher of the New Yorker, and the fiction editor, Catherine Sargent Angel noticed Andy's writings in other journals. They asked Andy to work part-time at the New Yorker as a staff writer. Though Andy met with them and continued to send the New Yorker his writing, he had a better offer. One of his roommates had a job making a promotional movie for the Cunard Cruise Line and was headed to Europe. At 9 o'clock one morning, he told Andy that in exchange for writing a movie script, he would earn $45 a week and would get to go on the cruise. At 5 o'clock that same day, they sailed to Europe. Just before Andy left, he sent out a poem to the conning tower. Catherine Sargent Angel saw the published poem and wrote again to Andy, but he had already set sail. Andy's poem in the New York World. For things that are a part of me, when days, by ending, make me old, when neither fortune comes nor gold, when love, with eyes that speak the truth, backs slowly from me, like my youth, and friends who know their way alone go forth and leave me one by one. Still must I very thankful be for things that are a part of me, that when I read a pretty line, a little flame goes down my spine, that when I see the morning sun, I laugh to think the world's begun. Letter to E.B. Wright from Catherine Sargent Angel, 1926. Dear Mr. White, the New Yorker looks with jealous eyes at your verse that led off the conning tower this week. And we all like it so much that we say, alas, that you did not send it to us. Mr. Ross and I are wondering whether you won't call up some day to have lunch with us, perhaps, or at least arrange to drop in at the office to discuss various thoughts we have in mind for you in connection with the New Yorker. Won't you do us the favor of giving us a ring? Sincerely yours, the New Yorker, K.S. When the ship returned to New York 6 weeks later, Andy debarked, picked up his mail, then walked to Child's Restaurant. While waiting for his dinner, he opened envelopes containing checks from the New Yorker. Nearly $178 spilled out, payment for pieces he had sent in before he left. At last he was being paid to write exactly as he pleased. Eventually, Harold Ross convinced Andy to work at the New Yorker. He earned just $30 a week, and for a time he had to get another job to make ends meet. Andy shared an office barely big enough for 2 desks, 2 typewriters, and a mountainous stack of yellow copy paper with another writer he barely knew, James Thurber. Andy was as reserved as Thurber was gregarious. From the first, we loved each other's stuff, Andy said. Andy's writing was becoming more popular. Thurber wrote that when someone came to the New Yorker offices wanting to meet E.B. White, Andy would slip moodily out of the building by way of the fire escape and hide in Schraff's restaurant until the visitor went away. White's job was writing captions for cartoons, short articles on current events called comments, and news breaks, humorous column fillers that poked fun at errors and typos in other magazines and newspapers. There's a secret joy in discovering a blunder in the public prints, Andy wrote. Almost every person has a little of the proofreader in him. Andy scanned newspapers and magazines for all mistakes, typos, and blunders. Readers also sent in clippings from all over the country. He then, sometimes, gave the newsbreak a headline from the list of newsbreak department heads, written by Andy and the staff. The punchline following a newsbreak was called a snapper. Most of the staff worked a typical 10 to 5 day, but Andy came and went as he pleased. He sometimes took off for Maine without telling anyone where he was going, but he always made his deadlines. One spring, Andy was traveling home from Virginia on a train and fell asleep. He dreamt of a mouse who was fully dressed in dapper clothing with a hat and cane. Andy wrote it all down. Later, when one of his 18 nieces and nephews wanted a story, Andy would read it aloud. He named the Mouse Stewart and kept the story in a drawer, sometimes adding new episodes. At the New Yorker, Andy and Thurber and Catherine Sargent Angel became fast friends. And though it didn't happen right away, Andy and Catherine fell in love. Catherine, however, was married with 2 children. But her marriage had been unhappy long before she met Andy. Eventually, she got divorced. Her children from that marriage, Roger and Nancy, would live with their father during the school year and with Catherine in the summers. Finally, one autumn, Andy and Catherine were married in a small ceremony. Just the 2 of them and their dog, Daisy, a present from Thurber. But Daisy got into a scuffle with the minister's dog. It was a very nice wedding, Andy wrote. Nobody threw anything, and there was a dog fight. They were both back at work the next day. Natural history. The spider, dropping down from the twig, unwinds a thread of his devising, a thin, premeditated rig to use in rising. And all the journey down through space, in cool descent and loyal-hearted, he builds a ladder to the place from which he started. Thus I, gone forth, as spiders do, in spider's web, a truth discerning, attach one silken strand to you for my return. From letters of E.B. White, date 1929. In May, when they learned Catherine was pregnant, Andy was so overcome with joy. He didn't know how to express himself, so he had their dog, Daisy, write a letter to Catherine. Daisy wrote, What White feels, he told me, is a strange, queer, tight, little twitchy feeling around the inside of his throat whenever he thinks that something is happening which will require so much love, and all on account of you being so wonderful. In December, they had a son, Joe McCoon White. Someday, when I'm out of sight, travel far but travel light. Stalk the turtle on the log. Watch the heron spear the frog. Find the things you only find when you leave your bag behind. Raise the sail your old man furled. Hang your hat upon the world. Joe, my tangible creation, happy in perambulation. Work no harder than you have to. Do you get me? From the Conning Tower. Title, Apostrophe to a Pram Rider. Date, 1931. To a writer, a child is an alibi. If I should never in all my years write anything worth reading, I can always explain that by pointing to my child. From Letters of E.B. White, date 1931. Even though America was now in the Great Depression, a time when many people lost their homes and businesses and had trouble finding work, Catherine and Andy kept their jobs at the New Yorker and were paid well. Catherine was especially lucky, as few women had jobs in publishing at that time. One summer, Andy and Catherine took Roger, Nancy, and Joel on a vacation, loading up their Buick sedan with everything from a playpen to a 9.5-foot dinghy. It was the first of their many summers spent in Maine. On one sailing trip along the coast of Maine, they anchored in a small cove in Blue Hill Bay. Directly in front was a rambling farm with a barn, just the kind of barn Andy had kept animals in while growing up on Summit Avenue. The next day, while driving down the road, they saw a for sale sign in front of this very house and barn. The Whites immediately bought the farm and the surrounding 40 acres for $11,000. In time, a spider, a pig, a gaggle of geese, and all the other animals, including a rat, that E.B. White was about to acquire, would make that barn famous. What happens to me when I cross into Maine? I cannot describe it, but I do have the sensation of having received a gift from a true love. From Points of My Compass. Title, Homecoming. Date, 1955. And we will stop here for today. We've been reading Sunrider, the story of E.B. White by Melissa Sweet. So we're reading about a Maine author, written by a Maine author illustrator. And we'll be back to continue the story tomorrow. For now, goodbye. Again, my name is Mary, and I'm from the Children's Room at the Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. And it's been a pleasure reading with you. Until next time, bye-bye.